Hello and welcome everyone in another episode of Researcher Celebrity. Today we have honor of having Dr. Lisa Crampton with us. A brief introduction of Dr. Lisa. She has done her bachelor's in biology honors from University of Victoria, and for masters she pursued studied ecology at University of Calgary. Then for PhD in ecology, evolution and conservation biology, she attended University of Nevada at Reno, where she did a brief postdoc and then joined US Geological Survey for volcano in Hawaii and USDA Forest Sciences Services, and currently is program manager at Kauai Forest Recovery Project and also an affiliate professor at University of Hawaii in Honolulu. With this brief introduction, we will welcome Dr. Lisa at the platform by saying thank you so much for taking time out.
Thank you so much for having me and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. So we always standardize, I have these questions that how and when you decided to become a researcher.
I have always loved biology, but it wasn't until I think I started in my bachelor's degree that I realized that I wanted to parlay that into a career in research. And so I guess in the keeping of the Halloween theme, in my bachelor's degree, I was fortunate to work in a lab where I was able to do an honors thesis researching snakes.
Oh,
So
wow.
kind of a creepy, crawly Halloween animal for you. And I really enjoyed the process of asking questions and testing hypotheses and then collecting data to analyze hypotheses. And where I still struggled a little bit was I wanted to understand how my fascination with the biological world could be coupled with my desire to make a difference in society. And it took me a little bit longer to figure that out. And that's when I found the path to conservation biology, where I can work on advancing conservation of our natural world and our natural resources with that fascination with, biological processes. So keeping in the Halloween theme for my master's, I studied bats.
Mhm.
And the question of the research, the central focus of the research was understanding how timber harvest would affect tree roosting bats. So in northern Canada, where there are no caves and no houses, bats don't roost in those structures. They instead roost in small cavities formed by, say, woodpeckers in trees. And so we thought that timber harvest might have very detrimental impacts on bats. And then, yeah, that led to a PhD where I worked on birds. So I guess I'm moving a little bit away from the Halloween theme.
And this, as we said, that so starting from snakes to bats to birds. So when let's start with this. When you decided that you want to make a commitment for PhD and move from Canada to United States, in the
Mhm.
first place, how you it is not only changing of the countries, but about pursuing a PhD where you figured out your research that what you want to do. But there are still some uncertainties which most of the graduate students are not very well aware when they are joining the program, and then they, as in when they move, they realize that. So, how was the PhD journey for you?
Yeah, I mean the difference between a master's and PhD is not trivial. A master's is a 2 or 3 year commitment of your life where you usually have a very defined project. And so I think for young people, it's a lot easier to wrap your head around a master's. A PhD is depending in some sciences it's 4 years, maybe three if you're in the UK, but in the US typically it's actually more like six, especially if you're in ecological sciences and you need to be measuring the annual variation that perturbs our system in addition to all the other variables that you might be interested in. Because, of course, as we know, ecological processes are very, very susceptible to, these annual differences, droughts and rainy years and cold years and so on. So it's a big commitment. And I think a lot of students, unless they really have this vision of themselves as an academic scientist, a professor at a university, they get into PhD because they love research like I did, and then maybe falter a little bit through because it does seem really big and daunting and this huge commitment. And unless you're convinced you want to be an academic scientist that requires a PhD, it can be difficult. And that is something I personally went through with because I didn't think I wanted to be a professor, an academic scientist. But I'm so glad I stuck with it because it provided me with a whole additional, really rich skill set on top of the skills I had learned in my master's in terms of especially experimental design and analysis and seeing something through that is a big commitment. And just the whole theoretical background that you develop for your field in a PhD that you only touch the surface of in a master's. And so even though I didn't go on to become an academic scientist, I feel like my current position as a program manager for a biological conservation project is really enriched by the background that I got during my PhD. I mean, I use what I learned in my PhD every day to make a difference for these birds that I'm trying to save, whether that be the experimental design, whether that be the data analysis, whether that just be the big foundation in ecology and conservation that I gathered. So, it was hard at times, but I'm so glad that I stuck with it because I really feel like it's allowing me to make a difference for these birds.
Absolutely. So let's move that after the PhD, when you already knew that the path you want to work on, and then where you are right now. The the struggle of a PhD student, the things which you have learned, because you mentioned that you are using all the knowledge you have gained during your PhD. Now it is about training the next generation of
Mhm.
researchers.
Yes.
How you think that your current position is helping training the other, next generation of researchers using the building blocks which you have gained in your PhD?
Sure. I mean, so first of all, I think that all my staff sees how I approach the issues that the birds are facing. We have a very experimental and hypothesis-driven approach to not only understanding what is affecting the birds the most, but what tools we can use to try to save the birds. So, for example, we run an experimental rat trapping grid, rat predation. These are island species, and rats did not occur in the islands prior to human arrival in the islands. So this is probably very different for Indian students, but rats are a very big threat to our birds because they have no fear of rats since they were never experienced they never experienced rats in evolutionary history. In fact, they had no mammalian predators. So one of the main threats to the birds is rats, and we run an experimental rat trapping grid to try to best understand what it is we need to do in terms of the kinds of traps we have, or the spacing of the traps we have, or the timing of the trapping we do to make the most difference to the survival of these birds that are threatened by rats. And so I hire a wide range of young people in my program, people fresh out of college, people who've worked a couple of jobs already. I also have some people with master's degrees. And regardless of their level, they can see that approach I have, that experimental approach I have, that hypothesis-driven approach I have to conservation and management. And also just my appreciation for the literature and understanding that we shouldn't try to reinvent the wheel. A lot of what we're trying to do is already grounded in somebody else's research. So just that kind of classical training from a PhD comes into our everyday efforts. But it goes beyond that. I have several employees that have worked with me to develop funding streams so that they can do a graduate thesis while being an employee of our organization. So I currently have one student who is working with us on that same predator control grid, actually. So he's part-time with me and part-time in a master's program. I graduated 2 last year. Prior to that, I had another 3 or 4 working with me, 4. And I'm about to in January start working with a current employee. He's going to go to graduate school and he's going to work on the species in my background, the Anianiao. So I also try to always figure out how in the grant proposals that I'm submitting to funders, I can write in a graduate student project and support a graduate student working directly alongside us in the program. And usually they are former employees.
This is very interesting also because now you already know the attitude and the aptitude of the graduate student. When you see a Nick, you know that this is the person you should train for the next level. Okay.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of the collaborative research, as you briefly touched about that, how we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. Some
Yeah,
fundamental work, the foundational work has already been done, which we have to implement. And like thinking about, like speaking of rats, like it's just like people were not aware that these things can actually make some of the bird extinct, the species. So one of the things which we always talk about researchers, that the observation is such an crucial key, that
right,
people might have seen it all over time, but just one person like you have thought like, wait, what if we do this thing and then let's see how the changes come? Because often we start the research with a hypothesis. Most of the time our experiments follow and lead us to the hypothesis which we want, but sometimes it goes vice versa, and then
right.
everything is upside down, and then we are not sure that what results we can interpret and then how we work with that. So in the cases when everything is working fine, nobody have to put extra ATPs into it, but when things are not going the way they are supposed to, how you have dealt with those situations, and then while training your students, how do you train them for handling those failed experiments?
Right. So I think the general approach is to step back and think about what important factors we might not have considered that might be bigger influences on the system. And so to me, that underscores the importance of documentation when you're doing your research and recording a wide variety of potential salient factors that might be influencing your system, whether it's time of year or whether it's something to do with the weather or and just being a good natural historian and keeping your eyes open. So to the point you're talking about, we had been successfully running this rat trapping grid for 3 years when one of my very astute technicians, in fact, the one who's going to graduate school now, noticed that instead of underneath the trap being a dead rat, there was a dead bird.
Mhm.
And it's just because he was being, very wide-eyed and open, minded and everything, that he noticed that it wasn't the intended target, right?
Yeah.
And so this led to 3 years of research about these traps, because the traps, in theory should only kill rats and should never kill birds because we're trying to save the birds. And we had to develop a whole suite of hypotheses. I think we came up with 5 as to why after 3 years we might suddenly have killed a bird. And that included, was there something different about the weather that might be driving prey sources or anything else that year? We had recently switched out the attractant that we put in the traps, trying to attract more rats. Did that suddenly make the traps attractive to the birds as well? So then we started manipulating the attractants we put in the trap. And so it led to a whole new suite of research that actually has been very profitable. And it has now been 4 years since we killed a bird, and we're still killing rats.
Right.
So at the end, it gave us a better result. But in the meantime, it really stopped us in our tracks, and we had to step back and really look at our system and think about our system.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the funding opportunities and, like, the challenges which research always have, like
Yeah.
funding. So when we are trying to do such an impact for an ecological system like Hawaii, where birds are so important for any ecological system, and here, uh, like more than a dozen of species are gone extinct. Researchers, when they are trying to work on recovery projects like you are leading, how difficult it is to get funding for the continuous effort.
Right. So on one hand, we're lucky because there is an entire stream of funding that is dedicated to endangered species research and conservation. And if you're not working on endangered species, you can't apply for it. So there are some very, very dedicated sources of funding that I have access to, which have helped advance our understanding and our ability to save these birds. Um, that being said, it was only, I've been in this job for 15 years, and it was only in maybe the last 5 years that the really, really dramatic crisis of Hawaii hit national attention. And so the first 10 years, it was much harder to attract that funding because people were sort of out of sight, out of mind with Hawaii. We're way out here in the Pacific Ocean, and everybody else is over near Washington, D.C. But nowadays, it has become much easier to attract that kind of funding because we, through our outreach efforts, as a community, a Hawaii community, have really managed to attract national attention. So we have had a lot more success lately in getting those grants. The other thing that has happened is that because we are a very small state and we are out of sight, out of mind, there was less funding available for Hawaii than there were for other states. But luckily, our lawmakers were able to influence a change in the federal government to make it so that more funding was available for Hawaii, given the extreme nature of this crisis. And so I think where I'm going with that is that it really behooves researchers to do a good job of outreach with the public and with lawmakers to help drive funding towards their causes. That being said, that outreach has also allowed us to tap non-traditional funding sources. So we have, for example, used crowdfunding as a tool to buy all those rat traps that we needed. And we ran a buy a trap campaign. And sometimes people donated the whole $150 that a trap costs, and sometimes they donated $25. But with that funding, I can't even remember how many hundreds of traps we were able to buy, from the public.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that as researchers in the conservation domain, we need to think about non-traditional funding sources, not just the big, Fish and Wildlife Service grants or National Science Foundation grants or whatever, but we have to think about how we can leverage the public's love of our natural resources to advance our aims.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the next topic of like the importance of community and stakeholder engagement in our research efforts, which is like for the first time, it's like led by the outreach programs, whatever we
Mhm.
have in there. And as you mentioned, that mostly people think about all the funding agencies, whereas if you go to philanthropists with the idea and they are ready to give you money that can boost the research in a long way, and that has been seen in the establishment of various organizations in United States and also all over the world, what I
Mhm.
have seen and experienced with. One thing which kind of restricts, because in general, for the general community and the public, they still think that scientists are those crazy people who can talk about science day and night. But when it comes for a conversation, having a conversation with a person who have never studied biology, okay, in for any graduate degree or so, but when we are going and have this conversation with them about either it is a fundraising or an awareness, because sometimes what happens is their observations are the key to start a new project or for the research question. So what are your experiences in the field?
In having conversations about science with non-scientists.
Yes.
Um, it's funny. I don't know very many of those scientists, the weird scientist stereotype. I don't know very many of those. Most of the scientists I know, and with a couple of exceptions, but most of them that I know are so passionate about their science and have spent so much time teaching undergrads who maybe, come in with a very shaky science background or whatever, that they're actually really good at breaking down concepts into very relatable pieces. I think in my personal experience, I'm fortunate. My dad is a scientist. He's an astronomer, actually.
Mhm.
Um, and my mother is a biologist, but she was a biology teacher. And she found a niche for herself when I was very young in leading nature walks for local school children through the different habitats in my hometown and teaching them about the seashore, or teaching them about the spring flowers, or teaching them about the salmon run when the salmon come back in the fall. And I always tagged along. And so I think I must have, imbibed that by osmosis, because I have never found it difficult to talk about science from, very, very, very basic principles. It's one of the things I feel like I actually am pretty good at. And I love to do talks here around Kauai to all sorts of ages, little kids, adults in the libraries, whatever. So um, I think that what we need to do as scientists is we need to think about how our science relates to something in everyday life for people. I'm trying to. I used a really good example the other day, and now it's escaping me. But I was trying to explain something complicated. I'm like, well, it's like, when you break an egg in and I used a kitchen reference or something, and as long as we can do that, then we can always, I think, connect with the public or with a philanthropist or with a lawmaker.
Absolutely. No, and I think part of this is just because, as you mentioned about your parents, I think that science runs in your blood. So it is way easier for you than anyone else to have these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fortunate, but you know, I think that you can also be who I am without having scientist parents,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely. And some of
so
our researcher celebrities have, shared their journeys and challenges that how they take this analogy that if they can talk to their grandmother and convince them about the thing they are doing, that is the golden standard, who has no idea about science, research, and anything. But if you can make them understand the problem and the prospective solution.
yeah, no, I think that's an excellent one. And so to that, my many people in my family are not scientists. My parents are, but many people are not, and same in my husband's family. And explaining, for example, the intricacies of how the mosquito control works, the incompatible insect tool works, can be really challenging. And I remember being at a picnic a few months ago when a friend of mine, came up to me and she said, "Explain this to me, how releasing more mosquitoes is going to help you get rid of mosquitoes."
I think that question is wherever we are going to use any kind of technology where either it is sterile insect technologies or incompatible one, where we are
Yeah,
realizing that is the standard question where everyone gets, asked at least 100,000 of time in their lifetime.
yeah,
Speaking of the questions and the challenges faced by scientists in SARE, and now let's say that some of the time now, in fact, this is the time when people started talking about women in STEM. That was a big time when people talked about this all over the world. And in developing countries, it is still going, which is a little bit better in here in the United States. But
yeah.
what were your experiences, and then how you can uh, motivate the next generation of researchers who happen to be women, that how they should prepare themselves towards the success?
Yeah, so I think um, that as in high school and in my undergraduate degree, I personally never encountered any sense that women couldn't be scientists. My obviously my family is very supportive, but I was very, very lucky to run into a whole series of male and female mentors in college that didn't, your gender didn't matter to your advancement in science. What mattered was up here
Yes.
and your work ethic.
True.
Um, and to be honest, that part of it continued throughout my graduate career. I will confess that one of the things that was difficult in my graduate career was encountering, even though people admired me for my mind and my work ethic, I did encounter some sexual harassment where, unfortunately, male professors just didn't realize how um, an offhand comment about women outside science even could be really hurtful to a woman. And I think that's a very real issue for female graduate students. We work still with men who came in different generation and thought that they could make kind of off-color comments about women's looks or women's bodies or whatever. And I'm hoping that that is changing for the women who are coming behind me in graduate school. And I suspect it is because the whole Me Too movement and everything has happened since I was in graduate school. But I will warn women that sometimes you have to have a pretty thick skin, and you also have to be prepared to turn around and say to a male professor, "Hey, I didn't appreciate that comment. What does it matter what I look like? It's what's up here that counts." And so I really encourage young women to find that backbone, because you will probably need it at some point. Um, And then the other thing, of course, that comes up for women and is finding many of us want to have families, and it is challenging. Academia is very demanding. Even my job is very demanding and time consuming. And children and partners are very demand and family are very demanding and time consuming. So it's really important to have open and frank conversations with your family about your family goals and your career goals, and find yourself a partner who is supportive of both your family goals and your career goals. And make sure you ask your partner to support your career goals in terms of, equal share of childcare and household duties and all those things. And make sure your employer,
Mhm.
employers traditionally have assumed that women would stay home and men would be able to be in the lab. And luckily, that's changing everywhere. And they will understand that your partner also needs to stay home and take care of the children so you can be in the lab. And it's really, I think, for those reasons, it's a very great time for young women to become scientists because the whole world is changing, and it's going to be easier to have careers like mine because both partners and employers are going to be more understanding of our desire to not, give a lot to our science, but not everything to our science, because we also want to have caring young children who will be the next generation of
Yeah,
scientists.
because that responsibility is also in all of us. So this also now let's take a moment to talk about the challenges of graduate school in
Hmm.
general. Like
Hmm.
now we like 20 years ago, probably not many people were thinking about mental health of
Yeah,
researchers. Now it is becoming a thing, which is a good thing, I say,
it
must
is
say
a good
that.
thing.
That
Hmm.
mental health, how a researcher at any stage, like it starts from the graduate school, either it is master's or PhD, then as a postdoc, then as an early faculty. It never goes low. It always increases. And
Yeah,
then you want to get the tenure, and then you want to become the professor, and then it goes all either if you are in academia or in industry, this never goes down. So your guidance or suggestion to the researchers who are facing some either the challenges or are trying to navigate their path to the next level.
yeah. So I think I will talk about several things that were key to me. First, really find the right advisor. Find an advisor that you can relate to personally, as well as through your science. I was really fortunate to find an advisor that she herself was, trying to figure out how to raise a child and be a good scientist. And so it was, really relatable, and she was very supportive of my goals. And I had a male advisor too. He was trying to raise a family, and his wife was a doctor, so he understood that, partner balance, that work-life balance. So and then be able to share your ups and downs with your advisor. They are there to help you make it through your PhD or your master's. That's their goal. And if they are not aware of what is troubling you outside your classwork or outside your thesis, how can they support you in your mental health goals, right? The second thing is a really good friend network, both within your program and outside your program. Make sure you have really great and supportive peers. And I was really lucky, our PhD program had an intake of 4 women my age. We were all struggling with the same big picture questions, small picture questions, and we're still friends. We still got together last year for somebody's 50th birthday. Um, but it was also important to have friends outside school so you could just kind of let it go and go skiing or go kayaking or go for a walk. So to that end, I guess that's underscoring the third piece, which is make sure you take care of your physical body and your spiritual body as well as your academic body. You've got to set aside time to make sure you're taking care of your whole self. Otherwise, your academic body and your will be let down by the fact that you're not nurturing your spiritual body. So I was very committed to the gym, and I was very committed to a hike on the weekends. And um, next thing is make sure you're aware and utilize the health resources at your school. And they should have a good mental health facility. There's no shame in using that. I think a lot of people feel shame when they feel like they have to turn to a therapist to talk to their issues, but they will be your greatest ally. And, I was telling you about that friend group earlier, the young women that we all started together. Every single one of us used the therapist at our mental health facility at some point or another in our graduate career, just to, sometimes it was just to talk things through and have an impartial and outside voice. And sometimes it was because we needed an anti-anxiety medication, or because we are all perfectionists. We all want to do so much in our careers. And, the great thing was we knew each other and trusted each other enough that we were all able to confide that we were seeing this woman, and it took the shame away. So that was really, really important. And I think by the time I realized late in my PhD career, maybe as I transitioned into a postdoc, that I could be a big help to all the people who came behind by being open about the struggles I had faced. And so I started talking about being in therapy. And by the time I started talking about being in therapy, half of our graduate program, if not more, came up to me and said, "Thank you for talking about this, because everyone's going through this."
That is one of the things, like at Researcher Celebrity Conversation, we always try to keep it in a way that we have the real experiences shared in here, because we never know that anyone who's listening to this conversation can correlate with your situation, and then now is, get got this encouragement to go to talk to the therapist. Because here in United States, it is still very, like, a little bit more acceptable than the countries like India, where people
Yeah.
still think this as a taboo, that, oh no, even I had real life experiences where I'm trying to tell my friends, my peers, that, hey, you should go see therapist, because I can totally see that because of the performance pressure, you are burning out. Yeah, like the burnout is another thing in researchers which people don't talk a lot, or at least some of them don't even acknowledge that they are at that edge, that if they don't go to therapy, then it's not only the loss of the resources or the time, but also a potential great researcher who
Yeah.
might end up quitting. And that has
Right.
been seen in cases not in India, but even in all over the world. I can say that after the training of 2 or 3 years into their PhD, that's when they
That's
decide to quit.
that's when it hits. Yeah, that's when you're just, you're tired and you're not done yet and you're anxious and your comprehensive exams are coming up, and it's a very intense time. And so my other word of advice would be there is there is always going to be more than you can do, and everybody knows that. And that's the biggest lesson of the PhD, is that at some point you're just going to have to say, I need to finish my PhD, and I'm going to write down this and this question or experiment or whatever on a piece of paper at the back of my notebook, and I am going to acknowledge that I could have done that, but I'm not going to be able to do that in the scope of a PhD, because at the end of the day I have plenty of other great work to support the hypotheses I have, and I've got to graduate, and enough is enough. And it's never going to be perfect. And I think that's so, so hard for all of us who've always thought that there was, a perfection or an end. And the greatest thing about science is there's never an end. There's always the next question, right? But in your PhD, it's just hard enough to say, this is enough.
That is so true. In fact, like, I remember when I started my PhD, and within first year, I started drafting the thesis. I was like, I wanted to have that the best thesis. So I started with the first year, and people used to call me that, are you crazy? You are in the first year of thesis. People start thinking of writing a thesis in fourth or fifth year. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not even going till that far time. But that is one thing which is sometimes very challenging for students who have not thought their entire PhD process through. Like,
Mhm.
this is something which we always say at in these conversation, that you should be thorough in your research before committing to PhD. Because
Yeah.
if there are two ways to do a PhD. A, you have given a project where everything is laid down, you just have to follow it, and then you'll be done with your a thesis. But sometimes some of us, and I'll say most of us, who have this uh, curious brain, they think
Mhm.
that before starting the graduate school, they think that science or nature is the publication which is coming out of their thesis.
Yeah,
And as you mentioned, after 3 or 4 years, it narrows it down to like, okay, wherever I'll send it, I just want to submit and publish a paper, get
exactly.
done with this PhD, because we always say that PhD is not the end, it is just the starting of your.
And it feels like it's the end. It feels like it's going to define your life. And it doesn't. It's just another thing that you have to check off, like all the core courses you had to check off to get your bachelor's degree. It's just another mile marker, but it feels like it's so um defining of who you are. And I think that is the biggest obstacle. It really isn't. When you get through to the other side, you just understand that it's another hoop that you've jumped through. And now you go on and you figure out where your path goes from there. I never thought that this would be where I ended up, but here I am and I'm so happy. 15 years.
Absolutely. And this is like where I always say that when things are like there are fortunate people who never have to troubleshoot, but they are very rare and very limited in their
Yeah,
graduate students. But most
right.
of the graduate students, we always say that you should know the way of rejuvenation. As you mentioned, either it can be physical, it can be spiritual, it can be your family and friends who are your support system, who are always there to hear you out. And sometimes people say that having a great conversation with friend can actually save you money to go to therapist,
True.
which I always say that it is up to you. If you feel one way is better than the one, please just you
I
have.
liked both, and the therapy at our university health center was free. There was no cost.
Mhm.
I ended up taking an anti-anxiety medication. It was free because the student insurance was so good.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I always say that even if you have to pay, nothing is more important than your mental peace.
Yeah.
Because you cannot even, like in probably in a shorter run, you cannot foresee it, but the way it hampers, like quitting a work of 3 years itself is a huge thing. If it can be saved by just going to therapy, I think that is the win-win situation. And this brings us to the next final words of the wisdom. In this conversation, we always have at towards the end of the conversation that the word of wisdom, what you can suggest to the next generation of researchers.
Oh, goodness.
You have touched upon on almost everything. Now this
I
is
know.
the making everything compact.
I think it is that. I think it's what we just said at the end is that this is just the beginning
Yeah,
and it's not going to define you. So, just it can be really hard at times, but try to enjoy your PhD and enjoy the process. And um, it's going to be very hard at sometimes, but it's going to be great at the other end. Just believe in yourself, believe in
absolutely.
your community. Yeah.
And so for this, for now, all the graduate students, I'll say that what you're experiencing right now is just the tip of the iceberg. You probably will laugh on your this journey after a decade or even after 2, 3 years. But
Yeah.
what the most rewarding thing is that with the PhD, it won't only change your name, but it will change your personality to
Mhm.
stand, to troubleshoot, to get over all the hurdles which you will encounter in your career, or in fact even for personal, I will say, because PhD trains you personally and professionally with the
Mhm.
time management and the responsibilities.
Yeah.
So we will say thank you so much, Dr. Lisa, for having this conversation with us. And as we always talk to audience saying that if they want to write to our researcher celebrity happen to you today, and then if they want Empowering Science Foundation, they can write email to us, and then we can put in touch with our researcher celebrities.
Sure. Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Okay.
Lisa. For
Thank you,
all
Raja.
researchers will say, stay passionate, enjoy your research, and if you need Empowering Science Foundation to help you, we are always there to help you.
Great. Thank you. Aloha.
Thank you.